There was a moment this week inside the Great Hall of the People in Beijing when the President of the United States looked directly into a television camera and announced what was supposed to sound like a historic American comeback. 200 Boeing jets. That was the number. 200. Donald Trump sat down with Sean Hannity after meetings with Xi Jinping and declared that China had agreed to buy 200 Boeing aircraft. He called them 200 big ones. He said Boeing originally wanted 150. He said he pushed the number higher. He framed it as proof that America was winning again. And for a few minutes, it worked. Cable news exploded. Headlines lit up. Social media surged. The political machine activated instantly. Because the story Washington wanted America to hear was simple. Trump went to Beijing. Trump negotiated personally. Trump brought home a massive manufacturing victory. That was the narrative. But then something happened that changed the entire tone of the story. Boeing stock dropped nearly 4%. Let that sink in. The President of the United States had just announced what should have been the largest Chinese Boeing commitment in nearly a decade. And Wall Street reacted like something was wrong. Very wrong. And this is where the story begins to turn. Because while most Americans were watching Trump celebrate in Beijing, another event had already happened quietly, almost invisibly, 8 days earlier in a Canadian aircraft hangar outside Montreal. A different leader, a different strategy, a different kind of power. And what happened there may end up telling us far more about the future of North American economic leadership than anything said inside Beijing this week. If you want coverage that follows the real story underneath the headlines, subscribe right now, because what happened next shocked Washington. At first glance, these stories seem unrelated. One is about Trump and China. The other is about Canada and Airbus. But they are deeply connected. Because what we are actually watching is not just a competition between Boeing and Airbus. We are watching two completely different systems of power moving in opposite directions. One loud, one quiet. One theatrical, one structural. And Trump may not have seen this coming. Think about the sequence carefully. Trump arrived in Beijing surrounded by some of the most powerful corporate executives in America. The Boeing CEO was there. The Apple CEO was there. BlackRock, Tesla, Goldman Sachs. This was not just diplomacy. This was American corporate power arriving in China as a unified political spectacle. The White House wanted one headline above all others. Boeing is back. That was the mission. Because for nearly a decade, Boeing has been trapped in one of the most damaging commercial freezes in modern aviation history. It started with the 737 MAX crisis, 2 fatal crashes, global outrage, international grounding orders, and then came the escalation between Washington and Beijing. Tariffs, trade wars, technology restrictions, political hostility, one administration after another, and slowly Boeing's access to China began collapsing. Between 2018 and the beginning of this year, Boeing delivered just over 100 aircraft to Chinese customers in total. Read that again, just over 100 aircraft across nearly an entire decade. In 2018 alone, Chinese airlines accepted roughly that many 737 MAX aircraft in a single year. That is not a simple slowdown. That is a major industrial setback. And while Boeing was losing ground, Airbus moved in, quietly, aggressively, relentlessly. In 2019, China ordered 300 Airbus aircraft in a single deal. Then more orders followed. And more, and more. By this year, aerospace analysts were openly describing Airbus as dominant inside the Chinese market. Dominant. Now pause and think about how dangerous that word is for Boeing. Because China is expected to become the largest aircraft market on Earth within the next 2 decades. Its commercial fleet could nearly double to around 10,000 aircraft. That market is not optional. It is strategic. It is long-term. It is essential. Which is why expectations before Trump's trip became so massive. Reports suggested discussions involving hundreds of Boeing narrow-body jets. Industry analysts modeled scenarios far larger than 200 aircraft. By the time Air Force One landed in Beijing, markets were already expecting a major Boeing announcement. The question was no longer whether a deal might be announced. The question was how big it would be. And then Trump announced 200 jets. 200, a large number by ordinary standards, but smaller than what many investors had expected. And suddenly the celebration started cracking. Because Trump did not specify the aircraft models, he did not identify the airlines involved. He did not explain whether this was a binding contract, a framework agreement, or a political commitment that still needed final paperwork. He said 200 big ones. That was the headline, and Wall Street noticed immediately. The stock dropped. Analysts went on television. Investors started asking the same dangerous question. Is this a firm deal, or is this another headline waiting for details? And this is the moment everything changed. Because 8 days earlier, before Trump even arrived in Beijing, Mark Carney had already walked into a hangar in Mirabel, Quebec, and quietly signed something far more concrete, far more specific, far more operational. 150 Airbus A220 aircraft. Firm order. Options for another 150. Approximately $19 billion. Every aircraft assembled in Canada. And almost nobody in the United States paid attention. Let that sink in. The loudest geopolitical headline in the world this week was Trump talking about Boeing on television. Meanwhile, Canada had already secured the largest commercial aircraft order ever signed for a Canadian-built aircraft program. And it happened almost silently. That contrast matters, more than people realize. Because this story is not really about airplanes. It is about systems, about strategy, about how power is shifting underneath the global economy, while most people are distracted by political spectacle. At the Mirabel ceremony, Mark Carney stood beside Quebec officials, Airbus executives, and AirAsia founder Tony Fernandez. No shouting, no dramatic television interview, no giant political rally, just signatures, contracts, factories, supply chains, jobs. The order pushed the A220 program beyond 1,000 total aircraft orders for the first time in history. And if you do not understand why that matters, you do not yet understand how serious this moment actually is. Because the A220 itself is part of a larger story about the slow transformation of North American economic power. The aircraft was originally Canadian, designed by Bombardier, known at the time as the C-Series, and the program nearly destroyed the company. Bombardier came dangerously close to collapse trying to build it. The Quebec government poured $1 billion into the program just to keep it alive. Then in 2018, Bombardier handed control of the aircraft to Airbus. At the time, many Canadians viewed it as a humiliation, a national industrial defeat. A Canadian company giving away its best aerospace technology to Europe. But history has a strange way of rewriting itself. Because 8 years later, the aircraft Canada almost lost has become the aircraft Canada is now selling to the world. Read that again. The plane once seen as a symbol of Canadian industrial desperation is now anchoring one of the largest aerospace manufacturing success stories in modern Canadian history. And here is where things get worse for Washington. The AirAsia order secures years of production inside Mirabel. Thousands of Canadian aerospace jobs are now stabilized. More than 850 Canadian suppliers benefit. Entire regional economies become more secure. The production line now has visibility deep into the 2030s. That is not a television announcement. That is industrial permanence. And permanence is harder to compete against than headlines. But Trump may not have seen this coming. Because while Washington was trying to reopen China politically, Canada had already begun integrating itself structurally into the Asian aviation economy. Quietly, strategically. And this is where the geopolitical implications become enormous. AirAsia is Malaysian. Southeast Asia increasingly sits at the center of global economic competition. The Mirabel production line builds aircraft for international customers across Asia and beyond. Meanwhile, Mark Carney had already traveled to Beijing months before Trump's visit. Read that again carefully. Months before Trump arrived with the Boeing CEO, Carney was already there. Meeting Xi Jinping, meeting senior Chinese officials, signing strategic agreements involving trade, energy, and aerospace cooperation. And unlike Trump's television announcement, these agreements were layered into a broader long-term strategy. Canada secured preliminary movement on canola tariffs. Billions in Canadian exports were potentially reopened. A target was established to increase Canadian exports to China by 50% before 2030. This was not improvisation. It was architecture. And the architecture is what matters now, because the world is entering a period where systems may matter more than speeches. Supply chains may matter more than slogans. Quiet strategic positioning may matter more than public confrontation. That is the deeper shift hiding underneath this entire story. The American strategy this week was personal, transactional, centered around one leader standing in front of cameras announcing a number. The Canadian strategy was structural. Factories already operating, aircraft already in production, contracts already signed, workers already hired. One strategy produced a televised commitment whose details remain unclear. The other produced signed contracts already moving through assembly systems. Think about that for a second. The contrast is brutal. 200 Boeing aircraft, models unspecified, contract structure unclear, terms undisclosed, versus 150 A220 aircraft, models specified, contract confirmed, value disclosed, production location established, options already included, and suddenly the bigger story no longer looks like Boeing alone. It starts looking like a warning that the old hierarchy of North American economic leadership may be shifting. Because there was a time when the assumption was automatic. America leads, Canada follows. Major aerospace headlines come from Washington or Chicago, not Montreal, not Mirabel, not Ottawa, but that world is changing, and it is changing quietly. Which makes it even more important politically, because quiet transformations are the hardest to reverse once they become embedded inside systems. And this is the moment Washington should probably be paying very close attention, because Airbus did not wait for American politics to stabilize. It expanded while Boeing struggled. It built relationships while Washington fought trade wars. It strengthened its Asian position while Boeing remained largely frozen out. The market adapted. The airlines adapted. The supply chains adapted. And once systems adapt, they rarely move backward easily. That is the lesson here. Not just for aviation, for geopolitics itself, because this story reflects something much larger happening across the global economy. Countries are recalculating. Alliances are recalculating. Industrial systems are recalculating. And America's traditional dominance is no longer being treated as automatic. That does not mean America is collapsing, but it does mean the competition is changing. The pressure is rising. The margins are narrowing. And the walls are slowly closing in around industries that once assumed they would always dominate. Meanwhile, Canada's approach under Mark Carney is being described as pragmatic, strategic, and focused on autonomy. Notice the language carefully. Not emotional, not ideological, strategic. Canada continues coordinating with Indo-Pacific allies. Canada still maintains tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Canada is still balancing security concerns, but it is also expanding trade architecture at the same time. That balance matters because it creates resilience. And resilience is becoming one of the defining currencies of modern geopolitical power. The American approach this week looked different, more personal, more immediate, more dependent on one announcement carrying the emotional weight of the entire visit. And if that announcement does not convert into firm contracts, the political damage could become serious. Because expectations were set high. The markets know that. Investors know that. Boeing certainly knows that. And history makes the situation even more complicated. This is not the first time China has promised massive American purchases. Back in 2020, Beijing pledged tens of billions in American goods purchases that never fully materialized after the pandemic reshaped the world economy. That memory still hangs over every new Boeing announcement like a shadow. Which means Trump's 200-jet declaration now exists under enormous pressure. Pressure to become real. Pressure to become signed. Pressure to survive the next political cycle. And meanwhile in Mirabel, the assembly line is already running. The supply chain is already active. The jobs are already stabilizing. The growth projections are already being revised upward. One side is still waiting for the details. The other side is already building aircraft. And that may be the single most important line in this entire story. Because history often shifts quietly before the public fully notices. Not with explosions. Not with dramatic speeches, but through contracts, factories, infrastructure, economic architecture. And suddenly what looked like a Boeing comeback story starts looking more like a warning that the balance of North American industrial influence is evolving faster than Washington expected. The loudest country in the room is no longer automatically the one controlling the future. Let that sink in. And now the question becomes unavoidable. Did Trump truly reopen Boeing's future in China? Or are we watching America celebrate a headline while Canada quietly locks in the next decade of aerospace growth underneath it? I want your prediction in the comments. Will Boeing truly reclaim China? Or is the future of North American aviation power already shifting north toward Canada and Airbus?